In the previous video, we talked about something known as the red blood cell and the structure, and I did mention that the red blood cell contains something called hemoglobin. Now, just a revision on hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is referred to as a globular protein. The reason why it's globular is because it is ball-shaped and water-soluble. It is also referred to as a quaternary protein because it is made out of 4 polypeptide chains. And the 4 chains are named as follows: the 2 alpha globin polypeptides and the 2 beta globin polypeptides. And each polypeptide chain has a heme group. Okay, now, so I'm drawing it out over here where I've labeled out the structure of the hemoglobin, and you also see those red colored dots, and the red colored dots are just the heme group, and they contain a particular type of mineral called iron, because the iron is the part of the hemoglobin that will bind to oxygen. That is the important thing. Incidentally, that is why red blood cells are red in color, because when iron binds to the oxygen, it forms iron oxide, and the iron oxide has a particularly reddish brown color, which is where the red blood cells get their colors from. So for this video, we are going to be focusing on the hemoglobin molecule. The first thing we have to understand about the hemoglobin molecule is the fact that one hemoglobin can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. The reason why that is so is because one hemoglobin has 4 heme groups. Each heme group can attach to 1 oxygen molecules, and therefore it becomes oxyhemoglobin, or also known as HbO8. Okay, so it's 4 oxygen molecule or 8 oxygen atoms. Just be wary of that. The important thing to know is the chemical reaction where Hb plus 4O2 becomes HbO8. Incidentally, what you have to know is this reaction is reversible. All right, so we are going to elaborate on that in a while. So let's talk about hemoglobin. The weird thing about hemoglobin is the fact that it has a duality. Now, what do I mean by a duality is? A duality is when it has 2 properties that are opposites of each other. Okay, so let's talk about this duality that hemoglobin has. You see, the first thing that hemoglobin has is hemoglobin has this characteristic where it readily wants to bind to oxygen, which means to say hemoglobin loves oxygen or has a high affinity to oxygen. So when it binds to the oxygen, it forms oxyhemoglobin. So you would think that this hemoglobin is this molecule or this protein that just wants to hold on to oxygen and never wants to let go of this oxygen. But that's where the second characteristic of hemoglobin comes in, which is why it's a duality, is that hemoglobin will readily release the oxygen when it's necessary. So the hemoglobin here is attached to the oxygen, it gives the oxygen a kick and it yeets the oxygen away. All right, so this is the weird thing about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin loves oxygen and it wants to hold on to oxygen as much as possible, but at the same time, hemoglobin is this sort of generous protein or generous molecule that would just give oxygen or let go of the oxygen when it is necessary. So hemoglobin is a rather wholesome molecule that you want to have a relationship with. It loves you, but it's also willing to let you go. Okay, right. We are really steering into a different part. Okay, back to biology. Now, so let's get back to biology. So this hemoglobin actually has a kind of weird love-hate relationship with oxygen, where it loves oxygen, it wants to keep on to the oxygen, but it also hates, I guess you can say it hates oxygen, and it also wants to kick the oxygen or let go of the oxygen when possible. So that is what I meant when I said that hemoglobin has a duality. Now, why is this duality important? So one of the problems with this topic when I teach my students is the oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, so this curve is something that you might have seen in your textbook, where on the y-axis it has the percentage saturation of oxygen in hemoglobin, and on the x-axis is the partial pressure of oxygen measured in kilopascal, and the general shape of the curve is like a sigmoid or an S-shaped curve. Okay, so when students look at this graph, they go, well, what is going on here? What is this? Okay, what is this whole thing about percentage saturation? What is partial pressure of oxygen? I want to know all that in detail. Okay, so let's break it down first. Before we go through the curve, we have to understand a few things. Let's look at the partial pressure of oxygen. What does it mean by a partial pressure of oxygen? Partial pressure of oxygen just basically means the concentration of oxygen gas in one area. Okay, so we use the word concentration of gas or partial pressure of gas interchangeably. For example, you are in a room and the room over here has low amounts of oxygen and the room on the right has a higher amount of oxygen. We can just say that the room on the left has a low partial pressure of oxygen and the room on the right has a higher partial pressure of oxygen. That's just basically what it means. Partial pressure of oxygen just means the concentration of oxygen in the air or in one particular area. That's it. Okay? So some students will go, can I use the word concentration of oxygen instead of partial pressure? You can, but just be aware that in the exam, they will use the word partial pressure. When you're talking about gases, it's always better to use the word partial pressure instead of concentration. When you're talking about solutions, however, then we use the word concentration. That's the difference. Okay. Now, then comes the other concept, which is the percentage saturation of oxygen in hemoglobin. Okay, this is a bit of a confusing one. All right. Now, to understand this, you don't need to memorize now. I don't need you to memorize this part of the explanation. I just need you to understand it. Okay. So, one red blood cell can contain at least about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. You don't have to memorize that. I just want you to know that. Now, instead of drawing out all 250 million hemoglobin, I'm just going to draw out 5 hemoglobin molecule, which I've represented in HB. So you can see those 5 HBs over there. Each HB represents 1 hemoglobin. Now, remember I told you earlier that 1 hemoglobin can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. So my question to you is this. If this red blood cell has 5 hemoglobin, how many oxygen molecules can it carry in maximum capacity? So the answer is, well, 1 hemoglobin can bind to 4, but since this red blood cell has 5 hemoglobin molecules, it can carry a total of 20 oxygen molecules in total. Now, imagine this red blood cell. I'm just drawing out some oxygen molecules attached to the hemoglobin. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to count the number of oxygen inside the red blood cell. So when you count it, you can actually see. So let's count the number of oxygen molecules, as we can see here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It has only 10 oxygen molecules within the red blood cell. So what is the percentage saturation? The percentage saturation equals to 10 oxygen molecules that it's carrying divided by 20, because that's the maximum that it can carry, multiplied by 100. And we will get a 50% saturation of oxygen in hemoglobin, which means to say that the hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cells are only 50% or half saturated. And it is only carrying oxygen at 50% capacity, which means to say it just has 50% more room to carry oxygen. That's what it means. Let's try another one, okay? And in this case over here, let's count it out. Let's count out the amount of oxygen, okay? So we're going to do it one at a time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So this red blood cell is carrying 20 oxygen molecules divided by 20 oxygen molecules, which is the capacity that it can carry, multiplied by 100, which means to say that the red blood cells, or the percentage saturation of oxygen, is 100% oxygen saturation. The red blood cell is fully saturated with oxygen, and it cannot carry any more oxygen even if it wanted to. So this is its max capacity. That's what I just want you to understand. You don't have to memorize this calculation. I just want you to know what percentage oxygen saturation means. So 100% oxygen saturation is just the red blood cell is 100% filled with oxygen. 75% just basically means it's 3/4 full or 75% saturated. And 15% just basically means that it only has, the hemoglobin has bound to only 15% of oxygen, and there is extra room within the red blood cells to carry more oxygen if it wanted to. This is what is meant by percentage oxygen saturation in hemoglobin. Now, coming back to the curve, on the x-axis, I put two values, low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of oxygen. Remember, what that means is you are just in a room or in an area where the air has a low concentration of oxygen, and on the high partial pressure just means you are in a room where it has a high partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, now if I were to just basically put a line on the low partial pressure of oxygen, it corresponds to about 20% oxygen saturation, and a high partial pressure of oxygen corresponds to at least, let's say, for example, 100% oxygen saturation in hemoglobin. So of course, what does this actually mean? Okay, what it means is, in this case, if you are in a room with a low partial pressure of oxygen and you took a deep breath in, you just took a breath in, the concentration of oxygen that goes into your lung alveolus will be very low because you only breathe in very little oxygen. Right? So when there is very little oxygen in your lung alveolus, very little oxygen will then diffuse into the red blood cell. And thus, your red blood cells will only be 20% saturated with oxygen. That's what that means. It means when you breathe in a low concentration of oxygen, your red blood cells are only going to be saturated at a very low percentage, like 20%. Conversely, if you're in a room where it has a lot of oxygen and you took a deep breath in, you took a deep breath in and a lot of oxygen entered the lung alveolus, what happens then is more oxygen is able to diffuse into the red blood cells in the capillaries, and thus your red blood cells will be 100% saturated with oxygen, which means the red blood cell is fully saturated. Okay, so that's just what it means. If you breathe in a low concentration of oxygen, your red blood cells will be less saturated with oxygen. If you breathe in a high concentration of oxygen or a high partial pressure of oxygen, it just means that your red blood cells are going to be fully saturated with oxygen. Simple, all right? So this is where the first characteristic of hemoglobin is important. If the hemoglobin is exposed to a high partial pressure of oxygen, the percentage saturation of oxygen in hemoglobin will also be high. Very straightforward, quite simple, okay? So students are like, well, yeah, that's obvious. However, what we have to understand is there is also another way to interpret the graph. I want you to see that word, the name of this curve. The name of this curve is known as the oxygen dissociation curve, okay? Dissociation actually means split. What split am I talking about? The split that I'm talking about is when the hemoglobin kicks the oxygen away, okay? It splits itself from the oxygen, right? And this is what we want to talk about. Now, I'm going to draw the graph, and I don't need you to memorize these values. Now, let's say 2 kilopascals, partial pressure of 2 kilopascals will give 10% saturation. A partial pressure of 4 kilopascals will give 40% oxygen saturation, all right? Now, let's imagine for a second that I have a red blood cell, and look at the percentage oxygen saturation in there. The red blood cell is traveling in the blood vessel, and how many percent oxygen is saturated? It is 100% oxygen saturation. That means the red blood cell is filled to the brim with oxygen. It cannot carry any more oxygen if it wanted to, okay? Now, let's say it's passing by a body cell. Now remember, a body cell constantly needs oxygen because of aerobic respiration. So the red blood cell over here, it has a lot of oxygen and their function is to give the oxygen to the body cells. Okay, so what happens is, for example, the red blood cell travels, reaches the capillaries, and then this is where the hemoglobin has to let go of some of the oxygen so that the body cell receives the oxygen, right? Okay, so the red blood cell on the left is still attached to the oxygen, oxyhemoglobin, but when it reaches the body cell, the hemoglobin splits with the oxygen and releases the oxygen so that the oxygen is able to reach the body cells. Simple enough. So this explains that hemoglobin must have a second characteristic where it must readily release the oxygen to the body cells. Not only must it keep the oxygen, but it must also be willing to part with the oxygen so that the body cells can receive the oxygen. So what does this have to do with the curve? Okay, let's explain this. Imagine two situations. I have a situation where the red blood cell, there's a one at the top and there's one at the bottom here, okay? So, for example, the body cell at the top has 4 kilopascals of oxygen and the body cell at the bottom has only 2 kilopascals of oxygen. So which body cell has more oxygen within itself? Correct. The body cell at the top still has a lot of oxygen, but the body cell at the bottom has very little oxygen left. So in this case, very simply put, the body cell at the top, well, it needs oxygen, but it doesn't need a lot of oxygen because it still has a reserve. But the body cell at the bottom, it only has 2 kilopascals of oxygen. So it kind of needs extra oxygen from the red blood cells, right? So what happens is, when the red blood cell at the top reaches the body cell, based on the graph, when it's exposed to a cell with 4 kilopascals of oxygen, if you look at the graph, the percentage saturation is 40%. Automatically, the red blood cell's oxygen saturation becomes 40% because that's what the graph says, okay? So from 100% of oxygen saturation, the red blood cell now only has 40% oxygen saturation. Then, of course, I will ask my questions to the student, okay? Where did the 60% of oxygen vanish off to? So where's the 60%, okay? The 60% of oxygen was basically released into the cells because the cell needed some oxygen, okay? If we look at the situation at the bottom, so when the red blood cell reaches the body cell at the bottom, the red blood cell is exposed to 2 kilopascals of oxygen only, okay? And based on the graph, 2 kilopascals of oxygen corresponds to 10%. So automatically, the saturation in the red blood cell becomes 10%. From 100%, it becomes 10%. So where did the 90% go off to? The 90% in this case over here is released into the body cells. Isn't this spectacular? You see, the cell at the top needed less oxygen, so the red blood cell released only 60%. But the cell at the bottom needed more oxygen, so the red blood cells released out 90% of its oxygen, so that it is only left with 10% oxygen saturation within itself. So what this means is hemoglobin readily releases more oxygen when the partial pressure of oxygen is very low. Okay, this is a weird thing about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is this weird molecule where if the cell needs less oxygen, the hemoglobin is like, okay, fine, I'm going to give you some oxygen, right? Especially at the top. But in the situation at the bottom, the cell needed a lot of oxygen, so the hemoglobin is like, okay, fine, I'm going to give you more. Okay, so of course, students will ask, how is the hemoglobin able to know this? Okay, we will talk about that in the next video. Okay, so this is a pretty spectacular characteristic of hemoglobin. Now, to bring it together, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a simple diagram of a circulation. I'm just drawing out the curve, and you have the curve right there. You have a lung alveolus, and because you're breathing in constantly, the lung alveolus usually has a high partial pressure of oxygen, Body cells usually have a low partial pressure of oxygen because they are constantly using up oxygen for aerobic respiration. Now, based on the curve, I'm just drawing out this curve over here. Let's say that the lung alveolus has a partial pressure of 12 kilopascals. So when the red blood cell reaches the lung alveolus, it is exposed to 12 kilopascals of oxygen. Based on the curve, okay, when it's exposed to 12 kilopascals of oxygen, based on that line, as you can see there in yellow, it will become 100% oxygen saturation. So the red blood cells are automatically filled up with oxygen because the oxygen diffused into the red blood cells from the lung alveolus. Okay, so these red blood cells will then move towards the body cells, and let's say the body cell has a 3 kilopascal worth of oxygen. So in that case, when the red blood cell reaches the body cell, based on the graph, 3 kilopascals correspond to 20%. The saturation in the red blood cell will automatically become 20%. So you're like, hey, wait a second, why is it 20%? Where did the 80% go off to? The 80% is released into the body cells that needed the oxygen. This is how you interpret the graph. So these are the two characteristics where on the left, hemoglobin readily binds to oxygen when partial pressure of oxygen is high, but hemoglobin readily releases oxygen when the partial pressure of oxygen is low.